Remembering Survival, inside a Nazi slave labor camp by Christopher Browning, narrated to you by Carter Banks. Chapter 9, Into the Camps. Even before the many Jews fated for deportation were marched to the train, siding and loaded into the waiting cattle cars destined for Treblinka, the work Jews were marched away from the marketplace to one of two sites. One was the sawmill and lumberyard complex, formerly the Jewish-owned Heller Lumber Business, until it was Aryanized in 1939. In most survivor accounts, it was referred to simply as Tartak. It was fairly close, just beyond the railway tracks and the Kamiena River to the south of Wiersbennik. Many of the original Jewish employees had continued to work there, and many other Jewish workers had been added under what was deemed to be a relatively benign Aryanization management. On the marketplace that morning, the assistant manager at Tartak, a man named Piatek, not only sought out his workers, but added others as well. As one such survivor noted, Piatek was the right hand of the director of the sawmill. He saved many Jews, myself included. The column destined for Tartak left around midday, guarded by Ukrainians from the factory security force Workschutz, and supervised by Schmidt and Schultz, two German policemen from the gendarmerie. The column was hurried along at a run by shots and dogs, but no one was killed during the forced march. Upon arrival, the prisoners were assembled and told to surrender their valuables. In the course of collecting valuables, the German policemen searched two young men from Pluck, about 20 years old, found a few zloty in their pockets and shot them. At this point, another tragedy unfolded. A young couple, the Tenenbaums, had smuggled their 3-month-old infant into the lumber yard in a small backpack and had hidden it in a woodpile. However, Fräulein Lutz, the secretary to the sawmill and lumberyard manager, heard the baby's cries. Unable to locate the baby, she informed the two policemen. They then threatened to shoot 20 prisoners unless the mother came forward. Pressured by the other prisoners, she did so and led the policemen to the baby's hiding place. According to one account, mother and infant were then shot. According to two other accounts, the mother and infant were taken to the nearby train that had not yet departed. Whatever the immediate fate of the Tenenbaum mother and infant, Fräulein Lutz had claimed her first victims. They were not to be her last. At least 2 additional Jews joined the prisoners at Tartak shortly thereafter. Mishulek Baranek, who had slipped away from the column marching to the train and hid in empty Jewish houses, made his way after dark to Tartak, where he found his mother. Piatek took a bribe, and Mishulek was allowed to stay. The next day, however, Walter Becker arrived, held a roll call, and immediately spotted the 12-year-old Mishulek, who was short even for that age. Becker grabbed him by the throat and asked his age and how long he had worked there. Mishulek said he was 15 and had worked there 3 months. The decent Piatek, who knew he was lying, vouched that he was indeed 15 and a good worker. Chaja Weisblum, already a worker at Tartak, had been urged by Piatek on the marketplace to join his group of workers. Reluctant to leave her children, she was separated by force. Her oldest son also managed to slip away before reaching the train cars and hid with one of the family's numerous Polish friends. After several days, he too reached the gate at Tartak, but could not get in. Chaja went to Piatek, who admitted her son. Once again, Becker, controlling for illegals, at a roll call, wanted to remove him, but the very decent and friendly Piatek vouched that this little boy could work as much as a man, and he was allowed to stay. The second destination of workers marched from the marketplace, where the Strelnica, or shooting range, beyond the munitions factory, formerly a low, flat field shielded by raised banks on the two sides where ammunition produced at the factory had been tested. Located diagonally across town on the northwest edge of Strakavica, it was much farther from the Wierzbnik market than Tartek. The long forced march of some 4 to 5 miles uphill from the Kamiena River valley to the far edge of town bordering the Bugaj forest was far more traumatic than the short march to Tartak. It also took part in stages. Starting around midday, different groups left the marketplace for Strelnica. The first group to depart for Strelnica was composed of some 500 men. It was followed closely by the women, who could see what was happening ahead better than the men in the front of the first group, who could not see what was happening behind them. All testimonies agree that the columns of workers were forced to run as the Ukrainian guards freely wielded clubs and rifle butts. It was an unusually warm late October day, and most Jews were wearing extra layers of clothing and carrying their backpacks or bundles of essential possessions that they had prepared in advance. As the grueling pace continued, many struggling Jews threw down whatever they were carrying. According to 3 testimonies, Poles lined the streets through which Jews ran. Not only did they rejoice at the Jews' misfortune and pick up whatever they could lay their hands on, but they also applauded, spit, and threw stones. Though some witnesses spoke generally about the guards firing blindly into the columns and killing many Jews on the way to Strelnica, more specific and detailed accounts render a somewhat different, though still lethal picture. According to several testimonies, the guards shot into the ground at the feet of the Jews to cause panic and make them run faster. As a result of flying stone splinters from such shooting, a number of people arrived at the camp with leg wounds. 2 men in the first group, Josef Rosenberg and Leib Spaget, refused to drop the baggage they were carrying and fell increasingly behind. The woman at the front of the following group saw what would happen to the unfortunate stragglers. One survivor recounted, "On the way to the Strelnica camp, I ran at the front of the group of women. I saw how a straggler from the men running in front of us was shot. A piece of the bullet struck through my left leg. The man murdered was named Josef Rosenberg. The murder was a Ukrainian guard." Another woman survivor recounted, "On the way, a man named Spagat, SIC is in brackets for some reason, was shot near me because he was carrying a packet. He fell down to the left of me. The shot was taken by a Ukrainian. Leib Spaget's son, Mosek, and his sister had worked the night shift and thus were not with him on the marketplace. Mosek later learned that his father had tried to carry the prepared packages of essentials for himself and his 2 children and had fallen behind when he refused to throw them down. As for the second group of men taken from the marketplace to Strelnica, there is a different story. One survivor, a skilled shoemaker, recounted, "Already at the beginning of my stay on the marketplace, I got in contact with the leader of the Ukrainian guard. I told him that he and his comrades had nothing to gain if they shot Jews. If he had brought our column to the camp without shooting, and also if his comrades did not molest us, he would receive a pair of ski boots from me. He threatened to shoot me if I did not keep my promise. Thus, it was that the column to which I belonged marched from the marketplace to the camp without anyone being shot. Many testimonies name Rosenberg and Spazaget, and only these two specifically, among the many Jews who were said to have been shot on the march to Strelnica. No women were specifically named. Thus it would seem, upon close examination of the evidence, but contrary to the widely held impression of many survivors, that Rosenberg and Spaget were the only fatalities of the march to Strelnica. Given the trauma of the killing and separation on the marketplace that they had just experienced following the frantic run to the camp, it should not be surprising that so many survivors remembered that latter event as one of random and widespread killing. Moreover, that was not yet the end of the killing that day. The columns that reached Strelnica discovered a fully prepared camp of 6 barracks on the higher levels above a lower field with an assembly ground and another building. They were not the first inmates of the camp. Jews from Ostrowiec, brought to Strachowitza after the liquidation of the ghetto there, had constructed the camp, putting up the barracks and wire fence. Other Jews from neighboring areas who fled to Strachowitza for employment had also then lodged there. And finally, some Jews, skilled craftsmen, the dentist, and selected members of the Judenrat, whom the Germans kept safe from the selection, had been allowed to move in with their families the night before. Having been forced to go to the camp on the run, the prisoners were now made to wait a long time. Key German personnel were presumably busy loading the train for Treblinka before they were able to make their way to Strelnica. A group of German officers eventually arrived, including Becker, by most accounts. Indeed, if the SS was turning over Jewish slaves to the factory management, it is highly likely that Becker, as the highest-ranked SS officer in the town, would have been present for what followed, namely, the collection of valuables that the SS still considered its own property. By some accounts, it was Becker, but most accounts it was another man, Willy Althoff, whom the prisoners were seeing for the first time, who climbed up on a stool or table and addressed them. Althoff was the chief of the factory security force, and now also the first commandant of the factory slave labor camps in Strachowitza. Althoff, rather than Becker, would be at the center of survivor testimonies of events that occurred over the next 6 months. Althoff emphatically told the prisoners that they must give up all their valuables, and he threatened that anyone caught trying to hide valuables would be summarily shot. In some accounts, a man was thereupon arbitrarily pulled from a row of Jews and shot on the spot, as a frightening example or for demonstration purposes to intimidate the rest to give up all their valuables. In other accounts, a young man was shot after he had been searched and found trying to hide money. There was also even more memorable killings mentioned in no fewer than 10 accounts. At the end of a traumatic and exhausting day, a pious young man, Abe Kumek, suffered a nervous breakdown. In one account, Kumek began suddenly to scream and cry to God. Althoff, sick, approached him. I'm guessing sick is his nickname. Althoff, sick, approached him, pulled him out of the row and shot him in front of all of us. Another witness gave a nearly identical description about this time one of the Jews among us lost his composure and began to scream. Althoff approached him, hit him in the face. Thereupon the man screamed even louder. Althoff drew his pistol and shot him. A different version of Kumak's death, one cast as heroic defiance, appears in the Wiersbennik community book. In this version, Kumak did not break down, but rather had the courage to start swearing at the Germans, and his fury made his last words an incoherent babble. Initially, there was no reaction by either Jews or Germans, since the scene was too surreal. However, Althoff then quickly recovered and proceeded to shoot the brave man. The Jews at Strelnica were presented with yet one more intimidating example. The butcher, John Kiel Rubenstein, a big, strong man who was assigned to take over the camp kitchen. Before he left for his duties, he was ordered to turn over any valuables and then searched. He was found hiding valuables. Althoff gave him a beating that would have killed a smaller person, but he survived. The incident was sufficient for all others who started to dig deep into their pockets and other hiding places and handed all that was left them. The demand for valuables posed to every Jew in Strelnica yet another terrible choice: to give up hidden valuables that could be life-saving in the future, or to keep them at the risk of search, discovery, and immediate death. For some, the fear and risk were too great. When they passed by the large boxes in which they were to throw their valuables, they gave up everything they had except their extra layers of clothing, which were not considered valuables by the Germans in any case, but were nonetheless very significant for the prisoners. Others emptied their pockets, but gambled on keeping gold pieces that were well hidden, such as in the heels of their shoes or boots. Some thought incredibly quickly and took a chance. 13-year-old Raquela Sacher rolled up the money her father had given her, wrapped it with paper, and substituted it for the cork in her water bottle. I opted not to give in. I think it was the first time I became mature, she recounted. Some got rid of their valuables out of fear, only to discover that another member of the family had taken the risk and made it through without doing so. One young boy turned over his valuables only to discover later a 100 zloty note that, unknown to him, his mother had sewn into a seam of his clothing. In general, it seems that women perhaps correctly calculated a lesser chance of search, took more frequent risks in keeping their valuables than men. For many of the Jews marched into Strelnica camp, their journey was not yet over. It was merely a transit point in which their entry into Strachowitza factory slave labor camp system was processed. Either that evening or the following day, they were transferred to yet another camp in Strachowitza called Majolka. It was located back on the east side of Strachowitza on a stone bluff overlooking the Kamiena River Valley. Two other small groups yet remained to be absorbed into the camp system. One consisted of the Jews who had been working on the night shift when the Aktion began. The other was the group of workers held back from the march to the camps to serve in Reinigungskommando, or cleanup commando, in Wiersbennik in the wake of the destruction of the ghetto. Many Jews had sought work on the night shift in hope that they would not be subjected to the expected ghetto roundup, which, according to incoming refugees from other towns, invariably began in the early morning hours. This calculation proved correct. By 6 a.m., it was clear to those at the night shift that the morning shift of the Jewish workers was not arriving. Moreover, they were not allowed to leave their factories to return home. Polish workers did arrive for the morning shift, however, and immediately told them that the Jewish quarter in Wiersbennik was surrounded and the roundup was already underway. According to several witnesses, the Poles were very happy and gloated about what was taking place. Some of those working in either the blast furnace of the steelworks or in the Rogalin brick factory, both located along the railway tracks in the river valley, were able to catch glimpses of the train being loaded if they were briefly allowed to find a proper vantage point. Thus, they saw what none of those marched off to the camps were able to witness, namely the loading of the transport to Treblinka, composed of 50 or more cattle cars and 2 passenger cars that began around 2 p.m. and was completed around 5 p.m. Some of the Jewish night shift workers were taken into either Strelnica or Mazowiecka late that afternoon or evening. Others remained for yet another night at the factory before entering one of the camps the following day. Some were not sent to the same camp as other family members, so they often did not learn for days who among their family had survived. Schwartner and Piatek were on the marketplace that day to ensure that sufficient members of workers were selected for their respective enterprises. It would appear that no one had been assigned the task of forming a cleanup commando, and that only at the last moment were additional Jews taken out of the mass of people destined for deportation to staff such a group. Some Jewish policemen who had stayed on the marketplace until the end to help keep order were therefore assigned, along with some members of their families. It would also appear that the chief of the Jewish ghetto police, Commandant Kornblum, as well as other policemen, were given considerable latitude in choosing others who would be given a last-minute reprieve in this manner. Liab Herblum was already on the march to the train when he was removed from the column and ordered to stay. Yashiel Eisenberg had not been selected for factory work, but was recognized by the 2 Jewish policemen who had brought him to Strachowitz from the nearby mines several days earlier. They asked him if he wanted to do town work, to which he readily agreed. Guta Blas's father and mother were brought over to join her in the Tartak group by her father's very good friend Kornblum. He then also chose her brother and young nephew for the cleanup commando. Altogether, 60 to 70 people were assigned for cleanup duty, among them a small group of 6 to 9 young girls. The very first task of the cleanup crew was to take care of the bodies of the many people killed that day. Some of the men were sent to the cemetery to prepare 2 large graves, separate for men and women. Others were given horses and wagons and sent street to street and house to house to pick up the dead and take them to the cemetery. Lieb Herblum, in his testimony about grave digging at the cemetery, introduced a macabre specter that haunts many testimonies of Strachowitz's survivors. In his account, a young Jewish man suffered a broken leg while digging. He was shot in the head, but the bullet only pierced his mouth, leaving him alive and fully conscious. His horrified co-workers were then ordered to bury him alive, and only at the last moment were they allowed to take him back to the lodgings where he was shot the next morning. As we shall see, this haunting image of being buried alive will reappear time and time again in testimonies. Following burial detail, the cleanup commando turned to cleaning out the houses of the deported Jews. They boarded up the houses, many of which had already been at least partially looted by Poles, and then collected clothing, linens, household goods, and furniture. The women did the sorting. The commando was under the supervision of the Schupo, not Becker's Gestapo, and members of the Schupo helped themselves to the best pieces. An auction was then held in which the Polish population of Strachowitz could buy the property of their former Jewish neighbors. The remainder was packed into large boxes and trucked away. Having easy access to food, clothing, and even money found in the empty homes, the cleanup workers lived well while the work lasted. Gradually, The commando was reduced, with some of its members being sent elsewhere, such as the policeman Nathan Gelbard's father, and never heard from again. Others were kept doing sorting and packing or other odd jobs such as tearing down dilapidated buildings, and then after several months were sent to one of the Strachowitz camps. There they gave many prisoners the news that confirmed for the first time the deaths of family members who had remained in their beds when the others had departed for the marketplace on the morning of October 27th. That concludes Chapter 9 and Part 2.